Hello, this is Greg Allison with Galactic Gregs. This is the first video of my new channel, Galactic Gregs. And we're going to hear a presentation now in just a couple of minutes from Amy Eskridge. She was presenting to the Huntsville, Alabama L5 Society on her new institute, which has been formed to promote the development of anti-gravity research. And her institute is the Institute for Exotic Science. Institute for Exotic Science.com. That's where you can find her website. And she's going to be talking about quite a few topics in this video, anti-gravity, and then she goes in the end to what they're going to do to try to help fund it. And there's an extensive question and answer session from the crowd. Now, here's the interesting thing about this topic in this video. This is a serious proposal here, serious organization that she set up, and it has a lot of really good people, including herself as president of the institute. And the attendees at this meeting are a lot of retired and active scientists and researchers at the Marshall Space Flight Center, NASA's largest propulsion, actually NASA's largest center, which is chiefly concerned with space propulsion. So these people have looked into these topics. There have been actual anti-gravity research efforts at the Marshall Space Flight Center and the University of Alabama in Huntsville, UAH, to include one of the topics will be Ning Li. Ning Li did alternating current anti-gravity. There will be many more videos here at Galactic Gregs covering topics on space, science, engineering, other technical topics of interest, many mainstream and some of them a little bit alternate, such as this one. And I've got many other topics to talk about. One of the things that we may be showing here is some of the efforts we did to develop hybrid rockets and launch them from high-altitude balloons with our HALO and HART programs that we were doing over 20 years ago. I'm going to come on here and talk about various topics of interest, things that are topical in the realm of space, science, technology, technical issues. I have another channel, Green Gregs, which covers homesteading, prepping, and survival type topics, including power grid defense. And I might cover some of that in this channel too, because there is some overlap with the technical side of things. So stay tuned and be sure to subscribe to the channel and bang the bell for update notifications.
Let's get right into it and talk about gravity. Just kind of to start with the basics. What is it basically? It's a fundamental physical force, interacts between different masses over both long and short distances. It controls the orbits of the planets, and those are all things we've heard before. And anti-gravity is basically the science of modifying gravity. So anti-gravity is kind of a misnomer. It's really more gravity modification, but colloquially it's called anti-gravity. So just kind of start at the beginning, right? So Copernicus published his theory of heliocentricity in the 1500s. And then Kepler, of course, came up with the planetary motion stuff in the 1600s. And then Newton published his law of universal gravitation in 1686. And I guess one thing to really note about his law of gravitation is that it follows the inverse squared law, meaning that it dissipates over a distance proportionate to the inverse of the square of the distance. It was measured first by Henry Cavendish in the Cavendish experiment. And then Einstein, of course, published his general relativity in the early 1900s. So that kind of leads us in, what does relativity have to say about gravity? So relativity says that gravity is basically a deformation in space-time. So sometimes you see those pictures of like a planet and then there's kind of a dip in space-time that it kind of sits in. And so relativity kind of says that anti-gravity is sort of impossible without negative mass. Some people would disagree with that, but that's what relativity has to say. And then, so the standard model of physics doesn't really include negative mass, so that's sort of a problem. So a lot of people talk about what you call unified field theory, which is there's four forces, right? There's gravity, electromagnetism, and then the strong and weak nuclear forces. And those forces are each mediated by a particle, so a photon, gluon, or the bosons. The graviton has been proposed, but never really been seen. So it's a proposed particle. And all of the other forces are unified, meaning that you have one theory that kind of agrees with all of them. But gravity is not unified, meaning that the theories that describe the other ones don't apply to gravity. And so it's kind of an incomplete picture, perhaps. And we all know that electromagnetism is quantized, magnetism is quantized. So a good question would be gravity, is that quantized too? And we don't really have a good theory for that right now, although some theories have been put forward. So one of the earliest anti-gravity machines that was kind of put forward was the Thomas Townsend Brown's generator, or Brown's gravitator. That was in the 1920s. He coined the term electrogravitics, which you hear sometimes in the literature these days. So basically you have an asymmetric capacitor here. So a capacitor where one electrode is larger than the other. And so that supposedly can create a thrust in one direction, but vacuum tests have kind of shown that that's perhaps ion wind and not the true anti-gravity effect. Sometimes you see these little, like on YouTube, sometimes you see these little foil lifters where it's like 3 sticks in a triangle and a piece of foil going around the top and then a thin wire going around the bottom. And that's kind of the same basic thing where it's an asymmetric capacitance thing. Some people call those simple anti-gravity lifters, but really those are just ion wind as well. They don't work in a vacuum. Of course, Nikola Tesla did a lot of work in this field. He had what he called the space drive, and this is one of his sketches of a vehicle that he proposed putting his space drive into. And so he patented that. The patent number's there. He called it anti-electromagnetic propulsion, and he talked a lot about electropulsation, and he had what he called the dynamic theory of gravity, which was really more of an ether theory, where he talks about ether filling all of the space, and he talks about mass being really just little vortexes of the ether, and then he says that, you know, as a particle decays, it's really just the ether kind of spinning down or not vortexing quite as fast and then dissipating. And he totally rejects the notion of curved space-time. So that relativity example we were just talking about you have the planet kind of sitting in the curved space-time, Tesla doesn't agree with that really at all. In 1948, the Gravity Research Foundation was founded by Roger Babson. He started an annual essay prize where you would write an essay on gravity, and then he would give, I think it was like a $4,000 prize at the time. And that prize has been won by many famous scientists. Stephen Hawking is one of them. 5 Nobel Prize winners have won the Babson Prize. Some of those essays are sort of in favor of anti-gravity being possible, and some of them are more critical. So this is actually an essay that won in 1953 by a scientist named Bryce DeWitt. And he was kind of talking about, just to paraphrase this, is you kind of need a good theory before you can really make a working device, is what he's kind of saying here. We don't really have the theory, so why do we have devices that we say work? So he's saying we're a little ahead of ourselves on that. So then in the 1950s, there were several government and government contractor programs. So there was something called the Aeronautical Research Laboratory, which is now called the Aerospace Research Laboratory. And they supposedly conducted many anti-gravity experiments on the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the 50s. And perhaps may still be involved with that now. And then there was the Research Institute for Advanced Study that later turned into Lockheed Skunk Works. In the 1940s, there was the Searle generator, and that was purported or claimed to be a combination of anti-gravity and free energy. It's kind of this like metallic, you've got like a magnetic ring and then an insulator ring and then like a copper on the outside. And there's these little cylinders that rotate. And the thing does rotate around and it makes a lot of noise and it appears to do something, but it's been sort of widely panned, although it's still in development with some modern efforts. There was the Dean drive in the 50s and 60s. This was claimed to be a reactionless drive, meaning that there's no propellant exhaust coming out as you thrust forward in one direction. It was basically like they have kind of a asymmetric weight thing that's asymmetrically kind of oscillating around, and it creates kind of like a linear oscillation. And a lot of people think that effect may be actually just due to the friction of the thing oscillating back and forth, and then the friction just kind of pushes it forward. So that's probably just an effect of friction. There was the Wallace machine in 1968. This one was patented. It's basically some spinning brass discs, and brass is 1/2 integer, nuclear spin. And so the idea of this is that you spin the metallic around, and it's supposed to align the nuclear spin. And then, he calls it the kinematic field. So he talks about the motion of metals, and he really gets into like the kinetic part of aligning the nuclear spin. Again, this one is unsubstantiated. There's a lot of people that talk about this was patented and then kind of fell off the map. And so sometimes people talk about maybe it went black or was kind of taken under, but it's also just kind of unsubstantiated. Lathwaite gyroscopes. So Eric Lathwaite was widely known as the father of maglev. His hypothesis was that these rotating spinning discs could create a force that's orthogonal to both the spin and direction. So if you look at this thing here, it's spinning on this axis, and then it spins on this axis as well, and then the force is in, I guess, this direction. So he had these big gyroscopes that he would like hold up over his head, and they were really heavy, and he would like hold it really effortlessly looking. And he did a lot of kind of interesting public displays of his, swinging his heavy gyroscopes around his head and that kind of thing. And so he made kind of a splash with that, but it maybe can be accounted for through centripetal forces and Newton's second law explaining the effect. So it's kind of a cool and maybe a useful effect, but it's not necessarily true like anti-gravity or gravity modification. In 1973, there was the Mansfield Amendment, and this restricted DOD dollars from being spent on non-military applications. So things like propulsion or, anti-gravity propulsion kind of fell under that umbrella. And so this kind of means that we're not really doing anti-gravity research in the public sector of the government anymore at all by legislation. And so kind of the explanation at the time was, well, this stuff doesn't work, so we don't want to waste money on it. But maybe another explanation is that they had their own black budgets and they didn't want to double spend on their other projects, so they just legislated that they couldn't do that anymore. In the 1970s, there was this guy, John Hutchison, who he's like all over. You can find videos of him on YouTube, like supposedly levitating things, and he was really trying to replicate Tesla's work. He was really big into Tesla, and so he noticed these anomalous effects when he was playing around with Tesla coils, and he claims that he replicated the Philadelphia experiment, which is of course the experiment where the ship like disappeared and then reappeared. This is a picture of a bar of metal that he supposedly could focus his machine on a metallic object, and it would just kind of like melt and twist down into itself. And then you would touch it and it wouldn't be hot to the touch. So there was no heat, but it somehow was rending the metal or deforming the metal in some way. And then he claims that after he did this successfully for a long time, that he started getting attention, and then people came in and started trying to get him to replicate it, and he lost his ability to perform the experiment, which kind of means you can't replicate it, right?
I saw one of those beams one time.
Yeah, my dad actually saw one of those. And
Yeah, the guy at Halfway Lab showed me one. It was a 6x6 beam. It was split down the middle and then twisted like it was taffy, but it didn't look like it had ever been hot. He had it mounted on a plaque. He brought it out of his office and showed it to him. He did experiments with Hutchison.
Yeah, so Hutchison is affiliated with the Hathaway Lab in Toronto. And they do have a lot of these metal pieces that have these weird deformations in them, but it's unclear exactly how that happened. And if you ask Cal Putoff what the cause of it was, he'll say, oh, I just think that guy was telekinetic.
He said it was telekinetic. Because this guy, according to these guys, he would sit there in his basement and he had these radio transmitters and Tesla coils and all this stuff, and there was no theory behind it. And he would sit there and adjust the knobs and do this and do that, sometimes for hours at a time. And then eventually, after an hour or two, weird things would start happening.
Yeah.
And so Hal thought that he was just telekinetic.
He just focused on it for hours
And
until it
that
happened.
he wanted it to happen so bad that just happened. And the strange thing about it was he was agoraphobic. He didn't want to go outside.
Yeah.
So he stayed in his basement all the time. But when people found out about his effect, they wanted him to come out and show it to people. So they took him to a psychologist and he gave him some pills for the agoraphobia. And they said that after he started taking those pills, he could never do it again.
So that's the loss of ability where he was suddenly not able to replicate it anymore. So according to Hal, it's because he was a telekinetic, but Hal believes in those things, so take that with a grain of salt. In 1990, there was the Woodward effect. So Jim Woodward is known as sort of the father of the Mach effect. So sometimes you hear about the Mach effect in like popular literature, but so this is another reactionless thruster, kind of like the Dean drive was a reactionless drive. So meaning that you get thrust, but there's no propellant coming out the other end. So he said that this would enable basically a warp drive where you have a large negative mass and then it warps space-time. And then what you have here is something called an Albuquerque plot. And so this is supposed to be like a compression and an expansion of space-time that basically causes it to like travel in one direction. In the 1990s, we actually had quite a bit of sort of anti-gravity research that was done here in Huntsville. And there was a UAH scientist named Ning Li, and she worked with a grad student named Doug Torr. This is Ning Li here, that's Doug Torr, and that's he was the chair of the physics department, that's Larry Smalley. And so she theorized that if you had a magnetic field on a superconductor, that it would align the ion spins and the ion matrix of the solid state ceramic, that it would align the ions and produce this gravito-magnetic, gravito-electric effect. And so Popular Mechanics did an article on her. NASA got involved and they did a collaboration in the late 90s. And then she actually left UAH and founded this company called Antigravity LLC. And that was in 1999. And if you look for her company, it's still registered, but no one really knows what they're doing. And she got a $500,000 DOD contract in 2001, and then it kind of ended there. What happened to Ning Li? So if you Google what happened to Ning Li, just Google that sentence. It's kind of like a weird internet legend that has originated out of Huntsville. This is a Reddit post under our conspiracy talking about, hey, what happened to Ning Li? Why did she get DARPA funding and then disappear? So that's just kind of an interesting internet legend that it's come up.
She had 2 other graduates.
Yeah, I've talked to some of them. I've run into people even outside of Huntsville in the sort of weird science anti-gravity community, and when they hear I'm from Huntsville, they're like, oh my gosh, Ning Li, what happened to her? Tell me. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what happened.
She was a member of HAL 5 for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people that have worked with her.
We took a tour of her lab
Really?
back in 1997 of the HAL 5 sponsored event.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, if anyone knows what happened to Ning Li, I would like to know.
I heard she went up to Maryland, around that area.
I've heard that. I've heard 3 different stories about Ning Li. I've heard that she got breast cancer from handling the toxic chemicals with the superconductors without gloves, and that she died in the U.S. I've heard that she went back to China and died there of breast cancer. I've heard that she just got sucked into the DOD and has been doing DOD stuff quietly ever since. And I've heard that she went back to China to get funding because she couldn't find funding in America, and so she's working in China now. There's a lot of different stories about.
Doug Tor went and founded a company.
Yeah, I've got a slide on that here in a second. So kind of related to the Ning Li thing is the Podletkanov effect. So this is a Russian scientist who, really within just a few years of Ning Li publishing her first paper about superconductors and gravity, he started doing this rotating YBCO disk. And YBCO is kind of interesting because it was actually invented out of UAH by a grad student, and it was famously stolen by another university and patented within like the next day of it being revealed to his professor. The next day he went to another university, was suddenly chair of the department, and was filing a patent for YBCO literally the next day.
So what's YBCO?
It's yttrium barium copper oxide. It's a superconducting material. It's one of the more high temperature ones. It was invented at UAH.
Same stuff Ning Li used, right?
Huh?
That's the same
Yeah.
stuff Ning Li used.
Yeah, Ning Li was using YBCO, and then Podletkanov kind of picked up from there.
Wasn't his name Doug Tor, wasn't it?
Doug Toria.
Yeah, he was the one that invented it. I think.
Yeah.
There's a, Richard saying there's a plaque there at
There is
UAH
a plaque.
somewhere.
Well,
Does anyone here know
Doug was,
Robert Becker? Because he worked with her as well. Robert
No
Becker?
name.
Do you remember him?
Doug was her student.
Yeah, Robert Becker did a quantized gravity thing where he took Maxwell's equations and then he kind of applied them to gravity, and quantized gravity kind of analogous to how you would electricity. And his thesis is over at UAH on PDF. I had to like go and take a picture of every single page of his thesis.
It's only been checked out twice, right?
Oh, I checked out Robert Becker's thesis at UAH, and it's only been checked out twice. It was checked out in 1999 by the DIA Interdepartmental Library Loan System, and then it was checked out by me last year. Rotating YBCO superconductors produces supposedly gravity shielding. And the kind of funny story about this is that he says that this was discovered because he was playing with superconductors trying to do something unrelated to gravity. And then a guy, one of his collaborators, walked into the lab and he was smoking a pipe, like a tobacco pipe. And the smoke drifted over the superconductor where the experiment was, and supposedly there was like a vortex in the smoke up over the superconductor. And so they started looking at kind of like what force is making that vortex in the smoke. And they investigated further, and they decided they thought it was a gravity wave or a gravity beam going up and perturbing the smoke above the superconductor. But he had a 2001 patent. He actually did collaborate with NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in the early 2000s, and the story goes that he came over here and we didn't pay for his travel and time, and he got pissed off about it and didn't want to come back anymore. But he claimed a 2% reduction in weight, and he was sort of like widely panned by the community. It was kind of a big splash when he first came out, and then a number of people, well, a small number of labs have replicated or attempted to replicate with varying degrees of success. There have been some near replications done by this guy, Claude Poyer, in France, and I've got a slide on him here in a second. But so Doug Tor and Jose Vargas, who was also at UAH here briefly, They actually then went to after the Ning Li stuff kind of wound down, they left and they went to the University of South Carolina, and they created basically their own gravity beam generator. And, you know, they talked about it being an inhomogeneous electric field. So they have like 2 electrodes, like one could be a sphere or like a hollow cone, or that they talked about different shapes of electrodes, but the idea is that they're asymmetric, so like one is different than the other. And then they've got a website called Experimental Quantum Gravity, which is still online, although it's unclear what their professional activity is or what they're still working on. It's kind of unclear, but their website is still up, I think, at the University
I
of
think
South
they were
Carolina.
awarded a couple of SBIRs and then they disappeared.
Yeah, so there's some evidence that they got some funding through an SBIR, and then they kind of fell off the map, just like Ning Li
Is
did.
that out of a patent, that picture?
Huh?
The picture out of a patent?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a picture of one of the conical electrodes. out of the
Jose Vargas actually came to NASA and pitched it to MSFC management, and he drew that picture on the wall in front of us. And he was talking about Kinslerian mathematics.
Kinslerian.
He used all these strange symbols, and nobody knew what in the heck he was talking about.
Yeah. Robert Becker is one of the like 12 people in the world that can read a Jose Vargas paper and understand what the heck he's talking about. Because like, right, so the Ning Li Popular Mechanics article, if you try to Google it, you cannot find it. It is not up anymore. You can find some other blogs that have reposted it, but it's no longer officially up. Doug Core's research was never made public by the university. Podletkinov, of course, was ousted by the University of Tampere almost immediately. And then Giovanni Modenese, who was Podletkinov's collaborator, I noticed last night I was doing some research and his Wikipedia page has been deleted. Oh, and there's also this book. I was at a sci-fi conference a couple years ago called Dragon Con in Atlanta, and they had like a sci-fi bookstore booth in the marketplace, and they had a whole bunch of science books, and I bought this book called Bogus Science, and then like years later I was flipping through it, and they were talking about Podletkinov, and they even mentioned Huntsville and the fact that Podletkinov had come over to Huntsville, and that they talked about Ning Li, but they didn't name her directly, but it was like obviously talking about her. And so there's sort of like maybe some kind of like undercurrent of let's go discredit this for some reason, either that or it really was bogus. It's hard to tell. Claude Hoyer in the 2000s, he's kind of like the only lab that has somewhat successfully done Podletkinov-like stuff and actually published. Right, so he has sort of a modified Podletkinov experiment where he does the YBCO. I think his doesn't rotate, it's just static, and is YBCO, and he claims to get a propelling thrust out of the superconducting disk. And so this is a picture of a liquid nitrogen dewar with the superconductor down in there, and he, actuates or triggers the emitter, and the dewar basically explodes from whatever force is caused by the superconductor, some kind of force coming out of the superconductor that explodes the liquid dewar. And this was actually tested at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in 2015, which has not been published. My dad did that, and they received very similar results where you can trigger the superconductor, and there is some sort of explosion that comes out of the superconductor, but when you take the disk out and look at it, it's totally undamaged. So the dewar around it explodes, but the disk is undamaged. So whatever force is coming out of it comes out of the disk in such a way that it doesn't blow it up. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, we took to testing them in mini buckets from Walmart because we blew up glass dewars. Blew them all over the lab, and it cost too much. So.
Don't forget, subscribe to the channel and bang the bell because we've got a lot more exciting videos to come here on Galactic Greg's.